Hello, and welcome to Education Chat, a podcast created by students for students. My name is Alyssa Ray, and my co-host Alicia Polino and I like to use this as a platform to connect with students in the Inland Empire and talk about important topics happening right now. Today, we're joined by Kristi Woods, who is the Dean of Instruction and Student Success from RCC. She also serves on the Equity Action Network team at GIA. So hello, Kristi. Welcome to Education Chat.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm happy to be here.
So once again, thank you for coming on. We are super excited to talk with you and just learn more about equity. To start, can you briefly explain what equity means and why is it important in regards to education?
Of course I can. First, I'll tell you what equity is not. Equity is not diversity. It is not multiculturalism. These terms represent the idea that we should have and ought to have representation from all groups in society, which I wholly and firmly support. But what diversity doesn't do, if your commitment is only to diversity, you may not be looking at different outcomes as a result of having a diverse student body or a diverse workplace. So once you make a commitment to diversity, the next commitment should be to equity. So equity is really about making sure that outcomes are fair and equitable across your diverse groups. So for instance, if you have a diverse student body, yet most of the students in honors are white students, there's not equity there. How come there are not more students of color in the honors program? So equity looks at outcomes. And much of equity is about systemic barriers that create differentiated outcomes based on race, gender, class, ethnicity, that kind of thing.
We're aware that you serve on the Equity Action Network team at GIA. Could you tell us what inspired that Equity Ant and what it was meant to accomplish?
Well, the GIA Equity Ant is focused on improving college-going rates in the Inland Empire. And that includes both Riverside and San Bernardino counties. And so just like I was mentioning what equity means, what we see across the board from K-12 to community college to university, college and university, is that there are not equitable outcomes, particularly for students of color, particularly for African-American and Latino students, even though at this point, these two groups are the majority in these two counties, yet they lag behind white and Asian counterparts in GPA averages, in number of units to completion, and actual transfer. So we, as the Equity A&T, work across sectors. So it's not just educational systems, but there's also community service organizations. We had for a while on our A&T team members from the criminal justice community. And the idea is to talk to one another and figure out how we can all support improving college going rates and completion rates for our students.
Especially in the IE, I feel like, because we're one of the biggest populations in California, and yet we have one of the lowest rates. So I find that really concerning, but I also do like that we have ants such as the equity to make that change happen. And that's one of the main reasons why we wanted to do this episode, just to kind of spread more light on it, since it is such an important topic, especially for me as a woman of color and Alyssa herself. So that's why I really like that you said that. So I do want to ask, what are some of the biggest challenges that you see students facing in regards to equity right now as an instructor yourself?
I think students still feel as if the institutions aren't designed for them. Our schools are structured on a model that was designed when the majority of the student population was middle class and white. And it's very rule oriented, it's very policy and practice driven, but there's also a lot of unspoken culture in educational systems, right? So when you get to college, this is why we refer to students who are the first in their families to go to college as first gen, because when I went to college, thankfully, I had older sisters that had gone to college. And so they could tell me practical things that you can't find in a handbook anywhere. I remember when I went to college, and I first went away to college, like 3,000 miles away. So I was very, very lonely. I'm not first gen, but very lonely. And I remember talking to my mother on the phone, and she used to always say, well, go here, go there, go get some help. 17 and 18-year-olds are not going to do that. That's why they call their parents crying, right? We have so many resources on college campuses, but we say, if you need help. Well, yeah, I see you shaking your head. You know where I'm going. We don't want to admit we need help because it makes it seem as if something's wrong with us. So so equity work has so many different levels, because some of it is just examining the language that we use so that we can really tell our students that we have resources to assist them in succeeding, because this is what colleges do. It's not that you need help any more than anybody else. We have built these institutions to serve and provide, all the tools you need for success. And isn't that a different message than saying, well, if you need help, go over here? So sense of belonging, I think, is really big. And then some of the other practical aspects or challenges are, again, we have to admit we've got racism and sexism. There's lots of homophobia in our society. Our schools are not, isolated from that. So students all feel that. We noticed during COVID that there's a big technology gap. So it's another one of these assumptions. Oh, well, everybody has a smartphone. Maybe so, but a smartphone is not a good tool to take an online class with. During COVID, especially, right? So 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 people at home in the house trying all to get on the internet. That's not going to work. So we have a lot of assumptions about access to technology that don't always fit with the lives of our students, much less whether they even actually have the technology. And then we have graduation rates and transfer rates are just really, really low, as you already commented on. So those are some of the bigger challenges.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that having that sense of belonging, because that is so important. And that does lead me to my next question, which is, we've seen research that has shown that when students of color receive instruction from teachers of color, the benefits are so great. How important is it to see diversity and representation in the classroom, and what are some of the benefits?
As you stated, they are remarkable. There's studies that show if a student, I think it's a male student of color especially, but if they have had a male teacher of color by 3rd grade, they're more likely to graduate from high school and go to college. But we know that's rare, right? Like male teachers of color in elementary school are unicorns. So that's a big lift societally that we need to do, because we have research that shows how significant it is. And this is where diversity is as important as equity. You have to diversify your faculty in order for students to see someone that looks like them, that might be more attuned to how to speak to them in a way that will engage them in their learning, right? That will not immediately kind of see them as other or as disciplinary problem. The statistics about Black, male, and Latino students being sent for discipline or suspended, right? Those rates are astronomical compared, again, to their white student counterparts. Think of the conversations you have in teachers' lounge and department meetings, all across the institution. The more voices that represent wider range of experiences that you have, the more impact it will have. And then again, not just what happens in the classroom, but then school policy and all the other things that make your education a place where you feel safe and valued. And that's why diversity is so important.
For me personally, my first teacher of color was until my freshman year of community college. So it's just, the data is there, the data shows. But when it also comes to hiring teachers of color, or I think the main thing is that it needs to not be performative. if you're going to do it, make sure they have the credentials to match it up. Don't just do it just to fill a quota. So that's a whole other conversation. We're not going to get into it, but I just want to put that out there. So I did want to mention how that the Equity Ant has many, many target populations, such as low income, DACA, first gen, foster youth, and young men of color, to name a few. How do you address these needs to each of these groups in order to reach the same goal of equity and equality?
Well, there are a couple of phrases that I always keep in mind when doing equity work. And in the ANT, the one we say the most is, where's the area of greatest need? So when you're looking again at all of these different groups, we're looking at the data. What does the data show us? So where is the area of greatest need if we're talking about suspension rates? Where is the area of greatest need where we're talking about food insecurity? Where is the area of greatest need if we're talking about transportation issues? And then that's who we treat. It's just like it's the triage model. You go to the hospital, the person with the sniffles is not going to be seen before the person in the ER, right, before the person with the broken arm. It just makes sense. It doesn't mean that those sniffles might not be important, but you've got an immediate need that needs to be addressed. That person needs a splint on that broken arm. A really focused equity program will be able to do that. The challenge is many people look at that as not fair. Everybody's not being treated equally, but equity is not about equality. Equity is about focusing on the area of greatest need. And then the second phrase that I like is, and then when you do that, the treatment, so to speak, still has to be intentional and deliberate. So if you're focusing on DACA students, you have to understand that particular population. You can't say, well, we're going to do for DACA students what we did for, the students in the honors program when they needed to go on a field trip. If you're honors students, none of them are DACA students. You can't compare the treatment. It might work, but you really have to be intentional and deliberate in thinking about who those students are, what their needs are, what's the best way to meet those needs and to get the outcome that you want. So start with the area of greatest need, and then as you strategize and implement a plan, make sure it's intentional for the group it's meant to serve, and that you deliberately serve those students and not make it a treatment for all. These problems are not new. They're not 20 years old. They're not 50 years old. They're 100 years old. Some of this is so deeply embedded. So it's going to take a lot to undo a lot of the practices that we have, because we've all been part of these systems that make it seem okay to do it this way because, it worked for me, right? I have a PhD. I came through these systems. It should be good enough. If I can do it, everybody can do it. That's probably true, but why should we do the same thing if we see so many obstacles to success for different folks? That's where the tough conversation.
Yeah, and like you said, this isn't a new problem. This has been happening for years and years. So how do you think we can break that generational problem that we have? Is there a certain age group to have this equality conversation? And what advice do you have for parents who want to do that with their kids at home?
I love that question. I'm a professor of history and ethnic studies. So one of the questions my students used to always ask me, one is, how come I never learned this in high school? And then the next thing they would always ask is, well, aren't some, I have kids, aren't they too young to learn about this? And I would say, why? Why are they too young, right? One of the best pieces of advice I got as a parent about when kids start asking questions is answer the questions, right? If they're old enough to ask the questions, they want to know. And even if it doesn't make sense to them, they want you to tell them something, otherwise they wouldn't ask, right? And then another thing I know as a parent is that kids are very keen observers of human nature, of human interaction, of society, and they have a very keen sense of what's right and what's wrong, and they can tell when people are treated fairly and unfairly. If you're a parent and you understand your kid and your kid says, that's wrong, I see somebody treating somebody wrong, or even if, sometimes and I hear this a lot. Like you'll be in the store and see a little kid and they'll look at you and they'll say, "Mommy, they're Black," or something like that. And then parents will get ashamed. They didn't say the N word. That would be a different thing. And we are so, in our society, are so afraid, right, to talk about race, that often parents shut their kids down, and then kids will think there's something wrong with making that observation. So, kind of parenting is a whole different ball of wax. But I do think, my parents were activists. That's why I'm an activist. I know it. I was raised this way. Everybody's not. But I do think that as a society, we can do a better job of acknowledging difference without making it seem like there's something wrong with acknowledging difference. And we really don't really understand the root causes of why these problems of equity are still embedded, right? Because, we've had a Black president. We had the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Legal discrimination is illegal, so there shouldn't be any problems. Why does it still exist? Because our institutions were built at a time when it was fine, and the practices that we have without reviewing them and saying, do these lead to inequitable outcomes? They won't change.
Even though it's hard to have the conversation with kids about race, it's even harder to have it with adults. So it's better to start when they're young, because when you're an adult, you have all these preconceived notions, and it's really hard to tell them this is right when they're thinking left. So it's easier to have the conversation when they're a kid, but it's also like, how do you have that conversation at the same time? Like, how do you do that without stepping on eggshells or saying the wrong things?
You can't, right? You can't. What we have to learn how to do is not expect some people to always get the I need to be comfortable space, and others, it's okay for you to be uncomfortable. When I'm talking about my experience, it might make you uncomfortable, but that doesn't negate my experience. And I should have the space to express it and not be shut down because what I'm talking about makes someone else uncomfortable. Because the only way for us to talk about equity and equitable outcomes for our students is to address it.
I just want to say that I like how attentive you are. I can tell you're a good teacher. So I just want to give you your applause, your flowers. So with that, you're welcome. With that though, I do want to thank you for coming on and sharing your story and sharing your experience. So with that, I do want to say, how are you spreading these resources and getting the word out to students and the parents that students are actually worthy of attending college, and that there are all these resources, like you mentioned, that are available to support them and guide them and show them that they can be successful despite what the data shows?
Well, GIA has a really good website and a newsletter. So that's the first thing. So their website is really good. And the first page on the website is an option to join the newsletter. So I would recommend folks do that. That's probably one of the best tools because all of those in the ANT share with GIA. And then, I would say that is probably also one of the missing pieces is good repositories of information. So, our college websites, and again, I'm speaking for community colleges in particular because we are required to have what are called student equity plans posted on our college websites and submitted to the state community college chancellor's office. So if anyone is interested in looking for what community colleges are doing, I would say go to their website or go to the California State Community College Chancellor's Office, and they can look up any community college in their area and see what their student equity plans are. And then many of the unified school districts are pretty much doing the same thing these days on their website. So there's a lot going on in the area of equity. Like I said, there's still a lot to do, but folks are really rallying around the awareness, the commitment, and almost the urgency to finally get some things right instead of continuing to meet to talk about it. There's many trainings. We've at our campus have brought in some really good consultants to help facilitate those difficult conversations. We have done what are called equity assessments or equity audits. And again, GIA has a tool called the Equity Continuum that some are putting into place. And it's almost like a worksheet that asks a series of questions. That's just the first step is, what do you put on the agenda at your meetings, for instance? Do you ever talk about your equity data? Do you ever talk about your student outcomes? Things like that. All these, like you said, all these little things to think about that we haven't really been forced to think about. And it's often those little changes that will make big differences in outcomes.
I really like that you said that. I'm liking all these answers. I'm like, what? I like all these answers.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you both.
Yes, it's been
enjoyed it.
so insightful to hear your experience and to hear all your answers. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Call me anytime.